On January 18th, 2008, a Friday afternoon in Paris, a compliance officer at one of France's most powerful banks was staring at a spreadsheet that didn't make sense. The numbers were too large, the positions were too big, and they were attached to the name of one of the bank's most profitable junior traders, a quiet, unremarkable 31-year-old from a small town in Brittany whose mother was a hairdresser and whose father was a blacksmith. A man whose university professors had described him as entirely average. A man who by January 2008 had secretly built up a trading position worth 50 billion euros. Not $50 million, not $500 million, 50 billion euros. His name was Jerome Kerviel. His official trading limit was $125 million, and he had exceeded it by a factor of 400. The positions Kerviel had taken represented more than the bank's total capital. Société Générale found itself at risk of collapse, not because of the subprime mortgage crisis, not because of a market crash, because of one man who had spent 2 years building a financial bomb inside one of France's oldest banking institutions, and who had done it so cleverly that the bank's own automated systems had fired warning after warning, and nobody had bothered to check. On 93 separate occasions between June 2006 and January 2008, internal monitors raised alarms about Kerviel's trading activity 93 times. And on each occasion, the departments who received the warnings took his explanation at face value and chose not to escalate. By the time anyone looked closely enough to understand what was actually happening, it was already too late. This is the story of how a blacksmith's son from rural France walked into the back office of a global bank, learned exactly how the system worked, and then used that knowledge to construct the largest unauthorized trading fraud in the history of modern finance. And the most disturbing part isn't what he did, it's what the bank did when it found out.
Here's the number that should stop you cold. In 2007, the year before everything collapsed, Jerome Kerviel's unauthorized trading activity generated reported earnings of 25 million euros for his desk at Société Générale. His official limit was 3 million euros in expected returns from legitimate arbitrage. He generated 8 times that amount. His fictitious profits represented 59% of the entire trading desk's total income in 2007. That figure alone discouraged any in-depth investigation. Read that again. More than half of everything his entire desk made that year was coming from one junior trader. A junior trader whose positions nobody could fully explain. A junior trader who had already triggered dozens of internal alarms. A junior trader who, when the German derivatives exchange Eurex contacted the bank directly to ask questions about his enormous trading volumes, was allowed by management to draft the formal response to Eurex himself, the very response explaining away his own suspicious activity. The bank called him a cash machine. His supervisors called him a star. And every time a warning came in, the fact that he was making the money was reason enough to believe whatever he said. And here's the contradiction at the center of the story. At the exact moment Kerviel was being celebrated internally as one of the bank's most valuable traders, he was secretly sitting on losses that would eventually reach 4.9 billion euros. The profits Paris was counting on were real, but they were built on a structure that was guaranteed to fail. Which raises the only question that matters. How does a junior trader with a limit of 125 million euros build a $50 billion position inside a bank with thousands of employees, multiple compliance departments, and automated monitoring systems, and not get caught for 2 years? The answer is the oldest story in finance. He knew where the holes were, because he had spent 5 years helping to build the wall.
To understand what Jerome Kerviel did, you need to understand what a back office is, and why being in it gave him an advantage that almost nobody in his position was supposed to have. He was raised in a small town in Brittany, where his mother was a hairdresser and his father was a blacksmith. He attended university in Nantes, then earned a Master's of Finance at Lyon, specializing in organization and control markets. Not one of France's elite Grande École, which produced the politicians and the executives and the front office traders with the million-euro bonuses. A regional university. A perfectly respectable education,
But in the deeply hierarchical world of French banking, it marked him as a back office man. He joined Société Générale in 2000, starting in the compliance department, before moving to a junior trading position 5 years later. For those 5 years, his entire job was to check other people's trades, to understand the bank's internal systems, to know exactly which numbers triggered an alert, which ones didn't, and how the automated controls communicated with the humans who were supposed to respond to them. He was, in the words of one account at the time, learning the anatomy of the machine from the inside. If you know how the bones connect, you know exactly where to apply pressure without setting off alarms.
When Kerviel moved to the front office trading desk in 2005, he brought all of that institutional knowledge with him. He understood the risk management systems better than the risk managers. He understood the compliance processes better than the compliance officers, and he used that understanding to do something remarkably precise. He didn't just hide his trades. He created fictional trades that exactly canceled out his real ones in the bank's systems, so that what appeared on the balance sheet was always a perfectly neutral position, regardless of what he was actually doing in the market. He created fictitious hedges and overrode risk limits to build massive directional bets, primarily long positions, exceeding 50 billion euros in notional value. When the automated systems were about to flag a position, he closed it before the check ran and opened a new one immediately after. He knew the schedule of the checks. He knew the thresholds. He knew the names of the people who received the alerts, and he knew what explanation each one was likely to accept. If you know how the bones connect, Kerviel began his unauthorized trading in late 2006. And like every story in this category, it started small. In January 2007, he took 850 million euros in short positions on DAX futures, betting that German stocks would fall. Within just 3 months, this grew at a geometric rate, peaking at over 30 billion euros by July 2007. By the end of 2007, his total concealed position had grown to 30 billion euros. By the first weeks of January 2008, it had reached 50 billion. At no point did he personally take a single euro. He did not siphon money into a private account. He did not buy property or fund a secret life. His lawyers would later argue in court that he committed no dishonest act for personal gain. What he was doing, he claimed, was making money for the bank. He genuinely believed the positions would pay off. He was, in his own mind, a star trader being held back by bureaucratic limits that didn't reflect his ability. That self-belief is important, because it explains why he kept going long after any rational person would have stopped. In late 2007, his concealed positions were actually generating enormous paper profits. He was right. The markets had moved his way, and that success made him more confident, more certain that he understood something the bank's risk managers didn't. Then, January 2008 arrived, and the markets moved the wrong way. In early 2008, by the time of discovery, his total unauthorized exposure had reached 50 billion euros, a figure exceeding Société Générale's entire market capitalization of $46.2 billion at the time. He was holding a position larger than the entire bank, with no authorization and no way out. On January 18, 2008, a Friday, Société Générale's internal control systems flagged an alert that Kerviel could not explain away. After being alerted by its control systems, Société Générale conducted an internal investigation and discovered that Kerviel had created fictitious trades to conceal one of his transactions. The bank immediately put together a team of 20 people to carry out systematic searches over the weekend. What they found over that weekend made the executives' hands shake. Massive positions totaling some 50 billion euros were discovered, which Kerviel had carefully hidden through fictitious transactions. The bank was staring at a position larger than itself, and it was still open, still moving with every tick of the market. The decision they made next is one of the most controversial calls in modern financial history. Rather than hold the positions and try to manage them slowly, the bank decided to close everything immediately, to unwind 50 billion euros in trades across 3 days, January 21, 22, and 23. The problem was that January 21st, 2008 was the same day that global equity markets began one of their sharpest falls in years.
in part because of fears around the American subprime mortgage crisis. The $4.9 billion loss is the result of the $1.4 billion profit on unauthorized positions that was concealed by Kerviel in 2007, less the $6.3 billion loss on the unwinding of positions, totaling nearly 50 billion euros set up in the first weeks of January 2008. In other words, his positions had actually been profitable going into 2008. The loss wasn't the trading. The loss was the unwinding, dumping $50 billion into a falling market over 72 hours. Kerviel later sued the bank,
arguing that the rapid liquidation amplified the losses far beyond what his actual bets had cost. That lawsuit went back and forth through French courts for years. What it revealed along the way was deeply uncomfortable for Société Générale. The Foltz report revealed that at least 75 alarms went off in 2007 for a variety of reasons. Trades booked incorrectly, problems reconciling profits and losses, counterparty risk, without anyone discovering the fraud. And on each occasion, Kerviel would correct the mistake, produce false documents, or give an explanation that his supervisors accepted without pushing further. This is despite abnormalities with certain trades, including products scheduled to mature on a Saturday. Logistically impossible. Someone looked at a trade that was set to expire on a day when markets don't operate, and no one followed up. An internal report by the bank found managers failed to follow up on 74 different alarms about Kerviel's activities. 74 times. Not once, not 5 times. 74 separate occasions where a system, a person, or a regulatory body flagged something abnormal about this one trader, and the response was to take his word for it and move on. The management treated 74 internal alarms as simple administrative matters. On one striking occasion, when the Eurex exchange sent reports regarding Kerviel's huge trading volumes, management accepted Kerviel's own explanation and allowed him to draft the formal response to Eurex himself. The bank let the person being investigated write his own explanation and sent it. Kerviel's lawyer stood in court and said something that deserves to be remembered. I have the feeling Jerome Kerviel is paying for an entire system, and there's something uncomfortable about that statement. Because Kerviel was convicted. He went to prison. He was sentenced to 3 years and ordered to repay $4.9 billion, a number so absurd that it was eventually overturned on appeal because a junior trader's lifetime earnings could not mathematically cover it. But the bank's chairman, Daniel Bouton, walked away. The supervisors who ignored 74 alarms, some of whom were dismissed, were never prosecuted. The institution that created the environment, built the culture, allowed the back office man to validate his own trades, and looked the other way because he was generating 59% of the desk's profits. The institution paid a fine of 4 million euros on a $4.9 billion loss. 4 million euros on a loss of 4.9 billion. That is a fine of 0.08%. Not even a rounding error. There is a concept in psychology called the bystander effect. When many people witness a problem, each individual assumes someone else will handle it. The more witnesses, the less likely anyone is to act. Société Générale had thousands of employees. It had compliance departments, risk teams, automated systems, and management layers, and yet 74 warnings about the same trader went uninvestigated. That is not the story of one rogue trader. That is the story of an institution that had built a culture where making money was the only question that mattered, and asking hard questions about how that money was being made was somebody else's problem. Nick Leeson destroyed Barings Bank in 1995 with the same dynamic. One person, trusted because he was profitable, concealing losses that grew until the whole thing collapsed. Jerome Kerviel nearly destroyed Société Générale 13 years later with an almost identical playbook. And in 2011, a trader named Kweku Adeboli did the same thing at UBS, costing them $2.3 billion. The names change. The bank changes. The country changes. The script does not. So here's what you need to take from this. Jerome Kerviel did not vanish. He was arrested at Frankfurt Airport, extradited, convicted, and sentenced. The 4.9 billion euro restitution order was eventually reduced by France's highest court after it was found that Société Générale bore partial responsibility for failing to catch what was in front of them. But here is what did vanish.
accountability for the system that made it possible, the culture that told traders that profit justified almost anything, the 74 people, or departments, or automated alerts that looked at an anomaly, heard one man's explanation, and decided that was enough. Kerviel's lawyer was right. He was paying for an entire system. He just happened to be the one caught holding the bag when it all came down. And the uncomfortable truth is this: the bag gets held by the same kind of person every time. Not the chairman, not the compliance director, not the head of the trading desk who ignored the alarms. Always the trader. Always the one closest to the trade, because the institution needs a face for the story, and it cannot afford to be its own. I want to know what you think. Is Jerome Kerviel a criminal or a product of a broken system? Or, and this is the question that haunts this story, can he be both? Drop it in the comments. Because the answer to that question says more about how you understand financial institutions than almost anything else. If you want to understand how the financial system actually works, not the clean version, but the real one, subscribe. I want to know what you think.